When Margaret Wells spent her last $300 on a crumbling lighthouse at a coastal village bankruptcy auction, it was a desperate gamble to provide shelter for herself after losing everything. Following her husband's sudden death and the crushing medical bills that consumed their savings, she never imagined that a collapsing wall in the lighthouse keeper's quarters would reveal a hidden chamber containing centuries-old maps, a captain's log, and a collection of Spanish doubloons artifacts belonging to the infamous pirate Captain William Blackthorne, whose legendary lost treasure had been sought by historians and treasure hunters for over 200 years. A discovery that would make her the target of ruthless treasure hunters, thrust her into high-stakes negotiations with maritime museums and historical societies, and ultimately lead to an expedition that would forever change her life and rewrite the history of colonial maritime piracy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The foreclosure notice arrived on a stormy Tuesday morning, tucked between a water bill and a supermarket flyer, as if its life-shattering contents were just another piece of ordinary mail. Notice of eviction, 30 days to vacate premises. Margaret Wells stared at the bold red letters, feeling her world collapse as she stood in the small kitchen of her seaside cottage. Through the window, she could see the turbulent gray ocean that had been both companion and tormentor since Robert's passing 8 months ago. "Not now," Margaret whispered, scanning the document for any possible exception or extension. There wasn't one. The entire row of coastal cottages had been sold to developers planning a luxury resort. All residents had 1 month to find new housing. No exceptions, no extensions. At 57, Margaret hadn't imagined she would be here, a widow with an art teaching degree, recently forced into early retirement when her small coastal school cut their arts program, and now facing homelessness in a rental market that seemed designed to exclude people exactly like her. She placed the eviction notice on the counter and took a deep breath, mentally calculating her options. Her savings had dwindled to just under $350 after months of medical bills and funeral expenses. Her brother lived across the country and was struggling with his own financial problems. Friends had already assisted as much as they could during the initial weeks after Robert's death. Margaret moved to the living room window, gazing out at the lighthouse that stood sentinel on the rocky point beyond her cottage. For 28 years, it had been the backdrop to her marriage with Robert, its beams sweeping over their cottage each night like a protective guardian. Now it was as abandoned as she felt decommissioned 7 years ago, when automated navigation systems had rendered human lighthouse keepers obsolete. She picked up the framed photograph of Robert and herself on their wedding day. His merchant marine uniform crisp and formal beside her simple white dress. "What would you do now, my love?" she asked the silent image. That night, after a simple dinner she could barely taste, Margaret opened her laptop and began the desperate search for affordable housing. The numbers on the screen mocked her. Studio apartments rented for nearly twice what she currently paid. For her 1-bedroom cottage, application fees alone would quickly deplete what remained of her savings. Every listing demanded proof of income 3 times the monthly rent impossible on her meager retirement benefits that barely covered groceries and essential expenses. She expanded her search radius, looking at towns farther inland, places with longer drives to potential part-time jobs, areas with higher crime rates, anywhere that might have anything she could afford. Each option seemed worse than the last. By 1:30 a.m., desperation drove her to search bankruptcy auctions, foreclosed properties, abandoned buildings, distressed real estate being liquidated to recoup debts. Most were dilapidated houses requiring massive renovations or vacant lots in remote areas. And then she saw it, former Pemaquid Point Lighthouse and Keeper Quarters. Minimum bid $250, sold as is. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, Subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret almost scrolled past it. What would she do with an abandoned lighthouse? But something made her click on the listing. There were only 6 photos. The weathered lighthouse tower with its faded white paint and rusted metalwork. The attached keeper's quarters with boarded windows. The interior of the quarters showing dusty. Furniture and peeling wallpaper. The spiral staircase leading to the lantern room. An aerial view showing the property on a rocky promontory extending into the harbor. And a close-up of the keeper's quarters' stone foundation, which appeared to need significant repair. The description was sparse. Former Pemaquid Point Lighthouse. Tower plus 1,100 square feet keeper quarters. Property includes all remaining fixtures and furnishings. Structure sound but needs significant renovation. No utilities currently connected. Zoned historical with residential allowance. Property sold as is. Margaret's exhausted mind began to calculate improbable possibilities. The keeper's quarters could be made livable with some work. The tower itself might never be functional again, but the attached living space had potential. The historical zoning meant there would be restrictions on external modifications, but it also meant certain tax benefits for restoration efforts. It was insane. She was a retired art teacher, not a contractor or engineer. The property was isolated, accessible only by a narrow causeway that flooded during the highest tides. And yet, what if this was her only option? What if $250 or whatever the final bid might be was the price of never having to worry about a landlord's whims again? This is absolutely crazy, she told herself, closing the laptop. But as she lay in bed listening to the waves crash against the shore, the idea refused to fade. By morning, what had seemed like midnight madness had crystallized into her best, perhaps only option for housing security. Margaret withdrew $300 from the bank, nearly everything she had left, and drove her aging Honda Civic to the county courthouse, rehearsing arguments to convince herself this wasn't the most desperate gamble of her life. The county courthouse was an imposing brick building with wide granite steps leading to heavy wooden doors. Margaret arrived 30 minutes early, clutching her bitter registration papers and trying to look more confident than she felt. The auction room was already half filled with people in business attire, professional investors and developers who did this regularly. "First auction?" asked a gray-haired woman with kind eyes, noticing Margaret nervously adjusting her bitter paddle. Margaret nodded. "Is it that obvious?" "We all start somewhere," the woman said, introducing herself as Eleanor Simmons. "Been attending these auctions for over 20 years. Looking for anything specific today?" "Actually, yes," Margaret admitted. "The old Pemaquid Point Lighthouse." Eleanor's eyebrows rose. "Interesting choice. Those historical properties can be challenging, but that lighthouse has good bones. What are you planning to do with it?" "Live in it," Margaret said, then quickly added, "Restore the keeper's quarters first, then gradually work on the tower." Instead of laughing, Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "Makes more sense than you might think. That property has stood against Atlantic storms for over a century. The quarters were built solid, and the location is spectacular. The hard part is utilities and making it properly livable." "I'm a retired teacher," Margaret said, "with some basic renovation skills from helping my late husband with projects over the years. I know it's unconventional, but I'm out of conventional options." "Unconventional is how preservation happens," Eleanor interrupted. "And between us, I doubt you'll have much competition for that property. Most developers want quick flips in residential neighborhoods, not long-term projects with historical restrictions." Eleanor's prediction proved accurate. When Lot 17, Pemaquid Point Lighthouse, came up for auction, the room remained quiet after the auctioneer announced the minimum bid of $250. Margaret raised her paddle, heart hammering in her chest. $250. From bidder number 23, the auctioneer announced. Do I hear $275? A man in a navy business suit casually raised his paddle. $275 from bidder number 9. Do I hear $300? Margaret raised her paddle again, silently calculating that this was her absolute limit. $300 from bidder number 23. Do I hear $325? The room remained silent. Margaret felt sweat beading on her forehead. $300 going once, going twice. The auctioneer scanned the room, sold to bidder number 23 for $300. The sharp crack of the gavel made Margaret jump. Had that really just happened? Had she actually purchased a lighthouse for less than the security deposit on most apartments? The next hour passed in a blur of paperwork, signatures, and transaction processing. The county clerk explained the property had been abandoned for nearly 5 years, with property taxes unpaid, since the Coast Guard had decommissioned it and transferred ownership to the county, which had failed to find a preservation partner. Interested in the history? It's one of the oldest lighthouses in the region, the clerk advised. You might need engineering assessments. These old structures sometimes have structural issues from constant exposure to salt air and storms. By noon, Margaret Wells, widow, retired art teacher, and now owner of a defunct lighthouse, clutched a set of keys and property deed in hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Congratulations, Eleanor said, finding her in the courthouse hallway. That's quite an adventure you're embarking on. I'm still not sure if I'm brilliant or desperate, Margaret admitted. Sometimes those qualities are two sides of the same coin, Eleanor replied with a wink. Here's my card. I've done some unusual renovations over the years, including converting an old fishing shack into a charming cottage. Call me if you need advice or contractor recommendations. Margaret thanked her and headed directly to her car. She couldn't wait to see her property up close. The drive took her along increasingly narrow coastal roads, past fishing villages and summer cottages, until she reached the causeway leading to Pemaquid Point Lighthouse. The tide was low, allowing safe passage along the narrow strip of land, connecting the lighthouse to the mainland. The limestone tower stood proudly against the blue sky, its white paint weathered but still visible, the glass lantern room at the top reflecting sunlight like a beacon. The attached keeper's quarters was a 2-story stone building that matched the tower, with a steep roof and shuttered windows facing the ocean. Using the key from the auction, Margaret unlocked the heavy wooden door to the keeper's quarters. The smell hit her first, the distinctive scent of a long-abandoned space, salt, dust, and old wood. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the boarded windows, illuminating floating dust particles and casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The main living area was approximately 18 feet square, with a stone fireplace along one wall. Abandoned furniture remained, draped in dusty sheets. Dining table, chairs, a writing desk, and bookcases built into the walls. A narrow hallway led to what had been the kitchen, a small room with an ancient cast-iron stove, a sink with a hand pump, and open shelving along the walls. Beyond that was another room that might have been a pantry or storage area. A steep staircase led to the second floor, which contained 2 bedrooms with iron bed frames still in place, and a small bathroom with a clawfoot tub and pedestal sink. A door at the back of the lower hallway connected the quarters to the lighthouse tower itself, where a spiral staircase wound upward to the lantern room, 91 steps that Margaret counted as she climbed carefully, testing each metal step before trusting it with her full weight. The lantern room at the top took her breath away, not just from the climb, but from the panoramic view of the Atlantic Ocean stretching to the horizon. The massive Fresnel lens had been removed when the lighthouse was decommissioned, but the metal framework remained, along with the rotation mechanism that had once turned the light. As an art teacher, Margaret assessed the space with both a practical and aesthetic eye. The structure appeared sound despite its age. The stone walls were solid. The roof didn't show signs of major leakage, and the wooden floors, while worn in places, were intact. The plumbing would need work, the electrical system a complete overhaul. But the bones were good. With careful planning and gradual improvements, this could indeed become a home. She was examining the kitchen space, mentally converting it into a functional modern cooking area, when a disturbing sound caught her attention, a deep, groaning creak from the wall beside her, followed by the unmistakable sound of shifting stone. Margaret stepped back instinctively, watching in alarm as a section of the kitchen wall began to bow inward, small pieces of mortar crumbling to the floor. Before she could retreat further, the lower portion of the wall collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending dust and debris billowing through the kitchen. Margaret covered her face, coughing as the dust cloud enveloped her. When it began to settle, she cautiously approached the collapsed section, expecting to see the foundation or perhaps the bare earth of the promontory. Instead, she found herself staring at an opening that revealed a chamber beyond a space that shouldn't exist according to the layout of the keeper's quarters she had just explored. The collapse had created an irregular archway about 3 feet wide, exposing what appeared to be a carefully constructed room hidden within the lighthouse's stone foundation. Heart racing, Margaret retrieved the flashlight from her phone and directed its beam through the opening. The hidden chamber was approximately 10 feet square, with a low ceiling that would force a tall person to stoop. Unlike the abandoned living spaces above, this room showed signs of deliberate concealment rather than mere abandonment. The beam of her flashlight revealed wooden shelves lining one wall, holding what appeared to be leather-bound books or journals. A small table occupied the center of the room, covered with what looked like aged parchment or vellum. Against another wall stood a sea chest with iron bands and a heavy padlock. Margaret hesitated at the threshold, unsure if the structural damage might spread or if the ceiling of the hidden room might be unstable. After a moment's consideration, she carefully stepped through the opening, testing the stone floor with her weight before proceeding. The air in the hidden chamber felt different surprisingly. Dry and cool, as if somehow preserved from the damp maritime environment. Her flashlight beam moved across the shelves, revealing a collection of navigation instruments, a brass sextant, several compasses, and what appeared to be a spyglass, all tarnished with age but seemingly intact. The table at the center of the room held what she now could see was indeed a map and aged nautical chart showing a coastline that looked vaguely familiar yet rendered in a style that suggested considerable age. Small notations in faded ink marked specific locations, with symbols that meant nothing to Margaret. Moving to the shelves, she examined the leather-bound volumes more closely. They appeared to be journals or logbooks, their bindings cracked with age but still holding together. The cover of the topmost volume bore ornate lettering that read, "Journal of William Blackthorne, Captain of the Crimson Serpent, 1723 to 1726. Margaret carefully opened the journal, afraid the aged paper might crumble at her touch, but it had been remarkably well preserved in the cool, dry environment of the sealed chamber. The handwriting inside was elaborate but legible, written in a flowing script with brown ink that had faded but remained readable. The first entry she read sent a chill through her body. April 17, 1724. Intercepted the merchant vessel Royal Fortune off the Carolina coast. Acquired significant spoils, including trade goods and Spanish gold. The crew surrendered without significant resistance upon recognizing our colors. Have decided to establish a northern cache at the old lighthouse keeper's residence, a location unlikely to draw the attention of crown authorities or rival captains. The keeper has been generously compensated for his discretion and assistance. Margaret's hands trembled as she read. William Blackthorne, a name she vaguely recalled from maritime history books, a notorious pirate who had operated along the Atlantic coast in the early 18th century. If this journal was authentic, she was holding direct historical documentation of piracy, during the golden age of sail. More importantly, the journal suggested that this hidden chamber had been used as a cache for pirate treasure. Northern cache specifically mentioned as being established at the old lighthouse keeper's residence, the very building she now owned. Her attention turned to the sea chest against the wall. Its heavy padlock showed signs of extreme age, the metal corroded and weakened by centuries of subtle moisture that had found its way into even this protected space. Using a piece of broken stone from the collapsed wall, Margaret applied careful pressure to the corroded hasp of the lock. After several attempts, the aged metal gave way, the lock breaking apart rather than opening properly. With trembling hands, she lifted the heavy lid of the chest. The hinges protested with a groan, but the lid rose to reveal the chest's contents, and Margaret gasped at what lay within. The chest contained several canvas bags, each about the size of her fist, tied with deteriorating cord. Beside these lay a leather pouch, a tarnished silver goblet, and what appeared to be a small pistol of antique design. With extraordinary care, Margaret untied one of the canvas bags and gently tipped its contents into her palm. Gold coins spilled into her hand, Spanish doubloons, their surfaces dulled by age but unmistakably gold, each bearing the distinctive shield and crown design of colonial Spanish currency. Margaret stared in disbelief at the coins in her palm, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. She had expected to find shelter in this lighthouse. Instead, she had found what appeared to be an authentic pirate treasure. As the implications began to sink in, Margaret carefully returned the coins to their bag and surveyed the hidden chamber with new understanding. This wasn't merely a historical curiosity, it was potentially an archaeological site of immense significance, containing not just valuable artifacts but direct documentation of an infamous pirate captain, whose activities had been only partially recorded in historical accounts. The financial value alone was potentially life-changing. Even a small number of authentic Spanish doubloons from this era could be worth thousands of dollars each to collectors. The historical value was incalculable. Original pirate journals and navigational charts from the golden age of piracy were extraordinarily rare. As she carefully made her way back through the collapsed wall into the kitchen, Margaret's mind raced with implications. Her $300 lighthouse hadn't just provided potential shelter. It had given her access to historical materials and artifacts that could be academically priceless and possibly valuable enough to secure her financial future entirely. The sun was beginning to set as Margaret locked up her new property and returned to her car. As she drove back along the causeway, watching the lighthouse silhouette against the darkening sky in her rearview mirror, she felt something she hadn't experienced since before Robert's diagnosis: hope. That night, back in her soon-to-be former cottage, Margaret researched Captain William Blackthorne, finding limited but consistent information. A notorious pirate who had operated primarily between the Caribbean and the North Atlantic coastline. From approximately 1720 to 1726, known for his strategic intelligence and unusually merciful treatment of captured crews. Presumed to have amassed considerable wealth through his raids on Spanish and English merchant vessels. Disappeared from historical records after 1726, his ultimate fate unknown, neither captured nor confirmed dead. Margaret's research shifted to maritime salvage law and historical preservation requirements. The legal landscape was complex, with overlapping jurisdictions between state historic preservation offices, coastal heritage agencies, and various federal departments responsible for shipwrecks. One thing became clear: she needed to be careful about how she proceeded. The discovery in her lighthouse could attract attention from multiple directions, not all of it welcome or benevolent. Treasure hunters and private collectors would be interested in the Spanish doubloons. Academic institutions would want access to the historical materials. Government agencies might assert claims on artifacts they considered culturally significant. Her simple housing solution had suddenly become considerably more complicated. And yet, as she continued her research into the early morning hours, Margaret began to see how Captain Blackthorne's meticulous records might provide her with options she hadn't previously imagined. The next morning, Margaret called Eleanor Simmons, the experienced renovator she'd met at the auction. Over coffee at a local diner, she shared her plans to restore the lighthouse keeper's quarters as her new home, carefully omitting any mention of her discovery beneath the kitchen. "The structure is surprisingly sound," she explained, "but I'll need guidance on bringing utilities back online and making this space livable." Eleanor was enthusiastic about the project. Historical properties like this have special grant programs available through preservation societies. The lighthouse's age and architectural significance make it eligible for funding that could offset much of your renovation costs. This was welcome news Margaret hadn't considered. How would I apply for these grants? The Maritime Historical Society would be your first stop, Eleanor advised. Their director, Dr. Thomas Hargrove, specializes in New England coastal structures. I've worked with him on several lighthouse preservation projects. By afternoon, Margaret had an appointment with Dr. Hargrove for the following day and a list of potential contractors experienced with historical renovations. She also had a growing plan for how to approach her underground discovery. That evening, Margaret returned to the lighthouse with basic supplies: battery-powered lanterns, a small propane heater, cleaning materials, and tools to better examine the hidden room and its contents. The tide was higher than during her previous visit, the causeway partially submerged, forcing her to time her crossing carefully between wave sets. Once inside, she made her way directly to the kitchen, where the collapsed wall still provided access to Captain Blackthorne's hidden chamber. With better lighting from her lanterns, the room revealed more details she had missed during her initial discovery. A small desk in one corner held what appeared to be a navigation logbook, its pages filled with entries spanning from 1720 to 1726, 6 years of observations, notes, and coordinates. Margaret carefully turned the brittle pages, reading entries that ranged from tactical assessments of potential target vessels to weather observations to philosophical musings on freedom and governance. One entry from September 1724 caught her attention. The northern cache now contains the accumulated wealth of 17 successful ventures, including the Spanish convoy intercepted off Bermuda. The lighthouse keeper continues his faithful service as guardian, compensated with fair share of our acquisitions. I have completed detailed charts marking all significant caches along the Atlantic seaboard, copies of which remain with this journal. Should misfortune befall me, these records shall ensure our accomplishments are not lost to history or claimed solely by the crown that drove us to this life. Another entry from April 1726, near the end of the logbook, proved even more intriguing. Rumors of increased naval patrols force a decision long contemplated. Have resolved to accept the Portuguese merchant's offer of passage and commission in the East Indies, far from the reach of those who now hunt me with increasing determination. The Crimson Serpent shall be scuttled in deep water, her secrets safe from discovery. My loyal crew dispersed with generous shares. This final cache contains my personal wealth and records, entrusted to the keeper's family with provisions for perpetual secrecy and maintenance. Future generations may judge our actions differently than the Crown does today. The logbook confirmed Margaret's initial assessment. Captain Blackthorne had deliberately concealed a significant portion of his accumulated wealth in this hidden chamber, along with detailed records of his activities. His final entry suggested he had fled to the East Indies rather than facing capture, explaining his disappearance from historical records of Atlantic piracy after 1726. Turning her attention back to the sea chest, Margaret examined its contents more thoroughly under the lantern light. Beyond the canvas bags of gold coins, she discovered a leather portfolio containing several more maps, detailed charts of the Atlantic coastline, with markings indicating what appeared to be additional cache locations. Each marked location included annotations about specific landmarks, depths, and contained valuables. Some notations referenced Spanish silver, others Portuguese spice cargo, and still others jewels from the Havana merchant. Most significantly, many of these locations were marked with small red crosses and the annotation undisturbed or intact as of 1726. The implications were staggering. If authentic, these charts potentially identified multiple undiscovered pirate caches along the Atlantic coast, historical treasures that had remained hidden for nearly 3 centuries. The value would be incalculable, both historically and financially. Margaret also discovered a small leather-bound ledger containing detailed inventories of each cache, including the one in the lighthouse. According to the inventory, this chamber had originally contained 47 gold doubloons, 16 Portuguese escudos, 12 silver pieces of 8, 1 silver goblet from the governor's vessel, navigational instruments of superior quality, and complete logbooks and charts. A quick count of the remaining coins suggested that perhaps 2/3 of the original cache remained, intact, still a significant find by any standard. The missing portion had perhaps been gradually removed by subsequent lighthouse keepers, who had maintained the secret over generations, until eventually knowledge of the hidden chamber had been lost entirely. As Margaret carefully returned the materials to their places, securing the sea chest as best she could, she realized that her lighthouse held far more than just shelter. It contained information that could fund not just her renovation, but potentially secure her financial future entirely if approached correctly. Preparing to leave, Margaret noticed something she had overlooked during her previous visit: a small metal plaque mounted beside the hidden room's original entrance, now concealed by centuries of construction except for the portion exposed by the wall collapse. Its inscription, barely visible beneath tarnish and dust, read, "Fortune favors not merely the bold, but the patient who understands when to reveal and when to conceal." W.B. Captain Blackthorne had created this cache not just to hide wealth temporarily, but as a long-term legacy, preserved until it could be properly utilized. The question now was how Margaret would honor that intention while protecting both the historical significance of the materials and her own interests. The causeway was nearly submerged when she left the lighthouse, her car's tires sending spray into the evening air as she carefully navigated the narrowing path to the mainland. The headlights caught the lighthouse tower in her rearview mirror, its silhouette now representing something far more complex than simple shelter. Margaret spent that night organizing her approach to the various aspects of her situation. The lighthouse renovation would proceed transparently with proper permits and preservation grants if available. The discovery of Captain Blackthorne's cache would require more careful handling, beginning with consultation with appropriate historical experts who could authenticate the materials without immediately triggering a free-for-all of competing claims. Dr. Thomas Hargrove of the Maritime Historical Society seemed the logical first contact. As a respected academic without direct ties to commercial interests or government agencies, he could provide expert assessment while helping navigate the complex legal and historical implications. The following morning, Margaret met Dr. Hargrove at the Society's offices in a converted waterfront warehouse. The historian was older than Margaret had expected, perhaps in his early 60s, with a thoughtful manner and obvious passion for maritime preservation. "Miss Simmons speaks highly of your lighthouse project," Dr. Hargrove said after initial introductions. "Pemaquid Point is an excellent example of early 19th century coastal architecture with significant historical value. I'm committed to restoring it properly," Margaret replied, carefully choosing her next words. "In fact, I've already discovered some interesting historical elements that weren't mentioned in the property listing." Dr. Hargrove's interest visibly heightened. "That's often the case with these structures. What have you found?" Margaret took a calculated risk. "Documents and materials that appear to be much older than the lighthouse itself," 18th century. In fact, I believe they're historically significant and wanted to consult with an expert before proceeding. The historian's eyes widened. 18th century? That's unexpected. The current lighthouse structure dates to around 1810, though there was a navigational marker at that location earlier. The materials appear to belong to a Captain William Blackthorne, Margaret added, watching carefully for recognition. Dr. Hargrove's reaction was immediate. Blackthorne? The pirate captain? That would be an extraordinary find. His activities are documented in colonial records and naval reports, but no primary sources, no direct materials from Blackthorne himself, have ever been discovered. This confirmation of Blackthorne's historical significance reinforced Margaret's sense that she had stumbled upon something truly important. I found what appear to be his journals, navigational charts, and other artifacts. I wanted to ensure they're properly preserved and evaluated by qualified experts. The historian's response was measured but enthusiastic. The Society would be very interested in assessing these materials. We have conservation specialists who could help preserve fragile documents, and our research team could begin evaluating their historical significance. I'd welcome your expertise, Margaret said carefully, though I want to maintain appropriate oversight as the property owner. Perhaps you could visit the lighthouse to make an initial assessment before any materials are removed for conservation. Dr. Hargrove agreed readily to this approach, and they scheduled a visit for the following afternoon. As they finalized details, the historian offered unexpected information. You should know that your lighthouse has been of interest to several organizations over the years. The Historical Artifacts Division at the state level made inquiries about purchasing it in the 1990s, but were deterred by county requirements for public access if they took ownership. This revelation added another layer to Margaret's understanding. The state had potentially known or suspected something about the lighthouse's historical significance, but had been unable to secure the property. Now that it was privately owned, different rules would apply to any materials discovered there. As Margaret left the meeting, her phone pinged with an email notification. The sender was unfamiliar, jcooper@coastaltreasures.com. The message was brief. Regarding your purchase of Pemaquid Point Lighthouse, our organization specializes in historical maritime artifacts and would appreciate consultation regarding any significant discoveries on the property. Generous compensation available for historically relevant items. Please call 207-550-187 at your earliest convenience. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Someone had notified this Coastal Treasures about her meeting with Dr. Hargrove, or they had been monitoring property transfers and had only now connected her purchase with historical interest. In the lighthouse, Margaret decided not to respond immediately. She needed more information and a clearer strategy before engaging with an organization that might be more interested in commercial value than historical preservation. Instead, she focused on practical next steps for the lighthouse renovation. A local contractor recommended by Eleanor provided an initial assessment of the work required to make the keeper's quarters habitable. The estimate was substantial, but not prohibitive if she could secure preservation grants. The most immediate needs were weatherproofing, utility connections, and basic structural reinforcements to ensure safety. The place has good bones, the contractor concluded, echoing Eleanor's earlier assessment. These old buildings were built to last. With the right approach, you could have the living quarters comfortable within 2 months. The tower would be a longer-term project. Margaret signed a preliminary agreement for the essential safety work, carefully budgeting her limited remaining funds while awaiting word on grant applications. She would need to find temporary housing when her cottage eviction date arrived, but Eleanor had generously offered her guest room as a short-term solution. That evening, Margaret returned to the lighthouse feeling an increasing sense of ownership and possibility with each visit. The hidden chamber beneath the kitchen drew her attention once again, this time with a specific purpose. If Dr. Hargrove would be visiting tomorrow, she needed to document the cache thoroughly for her own protection. Using her phone, Margaret photographed each map, document, and journal entry of significance, paying particular attention to the inventory ledger and location markers. She wasn't entirely sure how she would use this information, but having her own complete record seemed prudent before allowing others to assess the materials. As she carefully photographed a detailed map of cache locations, Margaret noticed something she had previously overlooked: small notations in the map, margins referencing secondary documentation, and master charts secured separately. This suggested that what she had discovered might be only part of Blackthorne's records, with additional materials potentially hidden elsewhere. Margaret was examining these notations more closely when she heard an unexpected sound: footsteps on the wooden floor above, in the main living area of the keeper's quarters. She froze, listening intently. The footsteps moved deliberately across the room, then down the hallway toward the kitchen. Quickly dimming her lantern, Margaret moved to a position where she could observe the kitchen through the collapsed wall section without being immediately visible. The beam of a flashlight swept through the kitchen, followed by the silhouette of a man examining the collapsed wall with obvious interest. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and moved with purpose rather than hesitation, not a casual trespasser, but someone who knew what they were looking for. As he directed his flashlight through the opening into the hidden chamber, Margaret could see his features more clearly, perhaps 40, with a closely trimmed beard and an expression of focused intensity. Margaret had several options. She could make her presence known and confront the intruder directly. She could remain hidden and observe his actions. Or she could attempt to leave unnoticed via the original entrance to the hidden chamber, which appeared to connect to a narrow passage leading away from the kitchen. Choosing the third option, Margaret quietly gathered her belongings and moved deeper into the chamber, locating what appeared to be the original doorway, now sealed, except for a small opening at floor level where the stones had shifted. Years of teaching had given her the ability to move silently when necessary, a skill now serving an entirely different purpose. As she carefully maneuvered through the tight opening and into a narrow earthen passage beyond, she heard the intruder entering the hidden chamber through the collapsed wall. His flashlight beam swept across the space she had occupied just moments before as she kept low and moved along the passage until it opened into what appeared to be a small cave at the base of the promontory, just above the high tide line. From this concealed exit, Margaret made her way carefully along the rocky shoreline until she reached a point where she could circle back to her car unobserved. From a distance, she watched as the man eventually emerged from the lighthouse and returned to a black SUV parked at the base of the causeway. He spent several minutes on his phone before driving away. This uninvited inspection confirmed Margaret's instinct to proceed carefully. Various interests were converging on her lighthouse and its secrets, each with their own agenda that might not align with hers. As the legitimate property owner, she had certain rights, but those rights would be tested against historical preservation claims, salvage laws, and possibly less legitimate interests. As she drove back to her cottage, Margaret's mind raced with implications and potential strategies. Captain Blackthorne's cache represented not just historical documents but potentially enormous financial value through the gold coins and the information about additional hidden caches. That value could secure her future and fund full restoration of the lighthouse, but only if she navigated the complex legal and institutional landscape correctly. What had begun as a desperate bid for affordable housing had evolved into something far more complex, a high-stakes game involving colonial history, pirate treasure, and competing interests. And at the center of it all was a retired art teacher who had spent her last $300 on a lighthouse at a county auction. The foreclosure of her cottage seemed almost insignificant now compared to the possibilities and challenges her lighthouse presented. As she prepared for bed, Margaret found herself wondering what Captain Blackthorne would do in her position, how the strategic mind that had successfully navigated the dangerous waters of piracy would approach these modern challenges. The answers seemed to emerge from her memory of his plaque in the hidden room. Fortune favors not merely the bold, but the patient who understands when to reveal and when to conceal. She would share this discovery, but on her terms, with carefully chosen partners who would respect both the historical significance and her rights as the property owner. The pieces were in motion now, and Margaret Wells, lighthouse keeper and guardian of secrets, needed to chart her course carefully through the approaching storm. Dr. Thomas Hargrove arrived at Pemaquid Point Lighthouse precisely at the scheduled time, his vintage Land Rover navigating the causeway with practiced ease. Margaret had spent the morning preparing for this critical meeting, carefully considering how much to reveal about Captain Blackthorne's cash. The Historical Society has been hoping someone would restore this property, Dr. Hargrove said as Margaret led him through the keeper's quarters. These lighthouses are irreplaceable maritime heritage. Margaret provided a brief tour of the main living spaces, discussing her renovation plans and the structural assessment she'd received. Dr. Hargrove offered helpful suggestions about historical accuracy and preservation techniques, clearly impressed by Margaret's commitment to maintain architectural integrity. You mentioned finding documents related to Captain Blackthorne, Dr. Hargrove said finally, his professional interest evident. That could significantly enhance the historical value of your restoration project. Margaret nodded, leading the historian to the kitchen area. I discovered something unexpected during my initial inspection. She indicated the collapsed wall, revealing the hidden chamber beyond. A structural failure turned out to be quite fortunate. Dr. Hargrove's eyes widened in genuine surprise. A hidden room? That's not in any of the lighthouse architectural records. It appears to predate the current lighthouse structure, Margaret explained, leading the way through the opening. What I found inside raises some interesting historical questions. The historian's gasp was audible as they entered the chamber, and Margaret illuminated it with battery-powered lanterns. Dr. Hargrove moved immediately to the desk, his trained eye recognizing the significance of the materials before him. This is extraordinary, he whispered, carefully examining the logbook. This appears to be Captain Blackthorne's personal journal from the 1720s. Historical value is immense. These materials provide unprecedented insight into colonial era piracy from the perspective of the participants themselves. Margaret watched carefully as Dr. Hargrove moved methodically around the room, examining documents with growing excitement. She deliberately directed the historian's attention to the journals and navigational charts, steering him away from the sea chest for now. The academic community would consider this a significant discovery, Dr. Hargrove declared after 30 minutes of examination. These materials could literally rewrite portions of maritime history from this period. That's why I contacted you first, Margaret said, choosing her words deliberately. I want to ensure these materials are properly preserved and studied. But as the property owner, I also want to maintain appropriate oversight of how they're handled. Dr. Hargrove nodded, his expression thoughtful. The Maritime Historical Society would propose a collaborative approach. We could provide conservation expertise and academic resources while you maintain ownership rights. Our primary interest is ensuring these materials are preserved and made available to qualified researchers. This aligned with Margaret's hopes for a balanced partnership rather than institutional appropriation of her discovery. What would that collaboration look like in practical terms? We would suggest documenting everything in situ first, then transferring select materials to our conservation lab for preservation work, Dr. Hargrove explained. All items would remain your property, with the Society serving as steward for research access under your authorization. The approach seemed reasonable, though Margaret noted the historian hadn't mentioned the gold coins or the map showing additional cache locations. Either Dr. Hargrove hadn't yet recognized that aspect of the discovery, or he was strategically focusing on academic value first. "There's something else you should know," Margaret said, deciding transparency with her chosen partner was essential. "Last night, someone broke into the lighthouse and specifically examined this chamber. I managed to avoid confrontation, but it's clear others are already aware of this discovery." Dr. Hargrove's expression shifted to concern. "That's troubling. Unfortunately, word travels quickly in circles interested in historical artifacts. Do you have any security measures in place?" "Not yet," Margaret admitted. "The lighthouse is relatively isolated, and I haven't had funds for a security system. The Society can help with immediate security arrangements," Dr. Hargrove offered. "We have protocols for protecting significant historical sites during initial assessment. I'd recommend we move quickly with documentation before others attempt to access these materials." As they continued discussing potential approaches, Margaret carefully raised the subject of the sea chest. Some of Captain Blackthorne's artifacts appear to have significant intrinsic value beyond their historical importance. How would those be handled in our collaboration? Dr. Hargrove's expression confirmed he understood the implication. "You're referring to the Spanish gold, I presume? I noticed the coins when examining the room, but didn't want to presume anything about your intentions." His forthright acknowledgement was reassuring. Historical artifacts with precious metal content fall under specific legal frameworks. As the property owner who discovered them, you have certain rights, but there are also considerations regarding cultural heritage and archaeological significance. "And what would your recommendation be?" Margaret asked directly. The historian met her gaze with professional candor. "Complete and proper documentation is essential, both for historical record and for establishing your discovery rights. After that, options include private retention, museum donation, or even sale through reputable historical artifact dealers. The Society can help navigate these options while ensuring proper archaeological protocols are followed." This balanced perspective was precisely what Margaret had hoped for: acknowledgement of the multiple values at stake without focusing exclusively on any single aspect. As they concluded their initial assessment, Dr. Hargrove proposed a formal collaboration agreement that would protect Margaret's ownership rights while leveraging the Society's expertise and institutional connections. They scheduled a follow-up meeting with the Society's legal counsel to draft appropriate documents. "One more thing," Dr. Hargrove said as they climbed back through the collapsed wall to the kitchen. "Be cautious in your communications with unknown parties. That email you mentioned, Coastal Treasures, they're likely a private artifact acquisition group. They tend to prioritize commercial value over historical preservation and academic access." "I've been wondering about that," Margaret admitted. "How much legal protection do I actually have as the property owner who discovered these materials?" "That's the complexity," Dr. Hargrove explained. "Various courts have established precedents regarding discovered artifacts on private property, but outcomes depend on specific circumstances, historical significance, and sometimes how the discovery is initially handled. The Society can help you navigate those distinctions effectively." After Dr. Hargrove departed, Margaret felt cautiously optimistic about their potential partnership. The historian had demonstrated both expertise and respect for her position as property owner, a promising foundation for handling the complex challenges ahead. That evening, Margaret carefully reviewed the photos she had taken of the cache contents, focusing on the maps showing additional cache locations. 7 distinct sites were marked along the coastline, each with annotations suggesting significant contents. "Thank you for your interest, gentlemen. However, I've entered into an exclusive partnership agreement with the Maritime Historical Society. that prioritizes both historical preservation and fair compensation. I'm not at liberty to entertain competing offers at this time." Cooper's expression hardened. "I'd urge you to reconsider. Historical societies operate on limited budgets and bureaucratic timelines. The value of your discovery could diminish significantly if competing interests become involved or if regulatory agencies assert control." "Is that a threat, Mr. Cooper?" Margaret asked calmly. "Merely an observation about how quickly opportunities can change in this field," Ames responded smoothly. "Our offer remains open for 48 hours. After that, market forces tend to complicate matters." As they departed, Margaret immediately called Dr. Hargrove to report the encounter. His response was both concerned and resolute. "Their approach is consistent with their typical tactics: pressure and veiled threats, followed by attempts to circumvent established partnerships. The good news is our agreement is now officially registered with state historical authorities, providing legal protection against interference." The attempted intimidation only strengthened Margaret's commitment to her chosen path. That evening, as contractors finished their day's work on essential structural repairs, she stood on the lighthouse observation deck, watching the sunset paint the Atlantic horizon in brilliant oranges and reds. The beauty of this place, her place, reinforced her determination to protect both its historical significance and her own interests against those who would exploit either. What had begun as a desperate housing solution had evolved into something that demanded courage, integrity, and strategic thinking she hadn't known she possessed. Over the next week, Margaret divided her time between practical lighthouse renovation, planning, and strategic management of the cash implications. The initial safety work on the keeper's quarters progressed rapidly, with contractors reinforcing structural elements and securing the building against weather damage. Eleanor introduced her to grant specialists who helped prepare applications for historical preservation funding, identifying several programs specifically designed for lighthouse restoration. The Maritime Historical Society provided supporting documentation, highlighting the property's enhanced historical significance due to Captain Blackthorne's connection and the newly discovered cache. Meanwhile, Dr. Hargrove's conservation team made remarkable progress preserving and digitizing the most fragile documents from the cache. Their work revealed additional details about Blackthorne's operations and the exceptional precision of his location data. His navigational calculations were decades ahead of their time in terms of accuracy, Dr. Hargrove explained during a progress update. Modern GPS verification of several landmark references confirms his coordinates are remarkably precise for that era. This validation of the data's accuracy substantially increased the potential value of the cache location information. With confirmed precision, recovery operations could target specific locations with minimal search area, dramatically improving operational efficiency and success probability. As Margaret reviewed these developments, troubling news arrived from Captain Williams. Coastal Treasures had filed a legal motion attempting to challenge the Society's partnership agreement, claiming prior interest in the historical materials, and alleging improper influence in securing exclusive rights. "It's a nuisance filing," Catherine assured her, "designed to create pressure rather than prevail legally. Their claim of prior interest has no documented support, and our agreement followed all proper protocols. However, it does signal they're escalating their approach rather than seeking alternative acquisitions." This legal maneuver, while unlikely to succeed, created additional complications for the partnership's plans to begin investigating the additional cache locations identified in Blackthorne's maps. Any recovery operations would now need to proceed with heightened security and confidentiality to prevent interference. The Society's archaeological team proposed focusing initially on the 2 emergency provision caches, which were located on private land where access could be negotiated discreetly. These smaller caches would provide valuable experience for the team, while establishing protocols for the more significant sites. Margaret approved this approach, working with Catherine to secure proper permissions from the current landowners. An organic farm and a private nature preserve, both amenable to controlled archaeological research after learning of the historical significance. The first expedition took place 2 weeks later, with Margaret joining a small team of specialists at the organic farm location. Using Blackthorne's detailed directions, they identified landmarks that had remained relatively unchanged over the centuries: a distinctive rock formation, the remains of an old stone wall, and the angle of approach from the coastline. Following these markers led them to a small clearing where ground-penetrating radar revealed an anomaly, approximately 3 feet beneath the surface. With careful archaeological techniques, the team excavated the site, uncovering a small iron-bound chest sealed in pitch to protect against moisture. The chest contained exactly what Blackthorne's inventory had described: a small quantity of Spanish coins, navigational instruments, preserved medicines, and sealed containers of what had once been emergency rations. While modest compared to the main cache at the lighthouse, this discovery confirmed the accuracy of Blackthorne's records and the potential reliability of the remaining locations. The farm owners were delighted by the historical significance of the find on their property, agreeing to loan their portion of the artifacts to the Maritime Historical Society's museum in exchange for recognition and educational programs for local schools. This positive outcome established a template for approaching owners of other cache locations. The second emergency provision cache, located on the nature preserve, yielded similar results: a small but historically significant collection that matched Blackthorne's detailed inventory. The consistent accuracy of his records increased confidence in the potential of the remaining more valuable cache locations. As these initial successes were documented and preparations began for approaching the merchant goods cache locations, Margaret received notification that her grant applications for lighthouse restoration had been approved. The historical significance of the Blackthorne discovery had elevated the property's preservation priority, resulting in funding that would cover most essential restoration costs. With financial support secured for the lighthouse renovation and promising initial results from the cache recovery operations, Margaret's situation had transformed dramatically from the desperate circumstances that had driven her to spend her last $300 at the county auction. The eviction from her cottage was now just days away, yet that once overwhelming crisis seemed almost insignificant compared to the opportunities and challenges presented by Captain Blackthorne's legacy. Eleanor's guest room would provide temporary accommodation while the lighthouse renovation proceeded, and the preservation grants would cover most essential restoration costs. More importantly, the cache discoveries represented potential financial security far beyond her immediate housing needs if managed thoughtfully and ethically. The key was balancing the legitimate interests of historical preservation, academic research, proper archaeological methods, and her own rights as the property owner who had discovered these long-hidden records. As Margaret watched contractors installing new windows in the keeper's quarters, she reflected on the remarkable chain of events that had led her here: the devastating loss of Robert, the financial hardship of medical bills, the threat of homelessness. Each painful setback had been a necessary step on the path to this lighthouse and its hidden cache. What had seemed like the end of security and stability had become an unexpected beginning. The widow who had spent her last $300 on abandoned property now stood at the center of historical discovery with the potential to transform both her future and our understanding of colonial maritime history. Captain Blackthorne's carefully preserved records hadn't just documented the past, they had created new possibilities for the present, connecting his strategic vision across centuries to provide both historical insight and unexpected opportunity. The responsibility of carrying this legacy forward would require the same careful planning and foresight that had characterized his original preservation efforts. As the sun began setting over the Atlantic, casting long shadows from the lighthouse tower across the newly repaired roof of the keeper's quarters. Margaret felt a growing sense of purpose and direction. The path ahead remained complex, but for the first time since Robert's death, the future held promise rather than merely uncertainty. The meeting room at the Maritime Historical Society headquarters buzzed with energy as representatives from 3 distinct organizations gathered around the polished oak table, each with their own agenda regarding Captain Blackthorne's cache and its treasure map information. Dr. Hargrove and Catherine Williams represented the Society's academic and legal interests. Elizabeth Chun from the State Historical Preservation Office attended to ensure proper protocols were followed. And surprisingly, Victor Ames from Coastal Treasures had requested to join after their legal challenge had been firmly rejected by the courts. Margaret sat at the head of the table, a position that would have seemed inconceivable just weeks earlier. "Thank you all for agreeing to this joint discussion," Margaret began, her teacher's voice carrying natural authority despite her nervousness. "Each of your organizations has expressed interest in different aspects of Captain Blackthorne's legacy. I believe a collaborative approach will best serve both historical preservation and appropriate utilization of this information." The proposal Margaret had developed with Catherine's guidance represented a bold alternative to choosing between competing interests. Instead of exclusive partnerships or jurisdictional battles, she suggested a coordinated initiative that respected each organization's legitimate role while maintaining her position as the facilitating owner. "I'm proposing the formation of the Blackthorne Maritime Heritage Initiative," Margaret explained, distributing detailed proposal documents to each attendee. "This would be a structured collaboration between academic, government, and private partners with coordinated research and recovery operations, guided by both historical significance and ethical considerations." The proposal outlined specific roles, leveraging each organization's strengths. The Maritime Historical Society would provide historical context and conservation expertise for recovered artifacts. The State Historical Preservation Office would ensure compliance with archaeological best practices and heritage protection laws. And Coastal Treasures, if they chose to participate, would contribute technical recovery capabilities and commercial expertise for appropriate items once properly documented. Most importantly, the initiative would follow a balanced approach to the 7 remaining caches in Blackthorne's records, prioritizing them based on historical significance, recovery feasibility, and preservation needs rather than focusing exclusively on commercial considerations. This framework addresses the complex jurisdictional and ethical considerations while ensuring appropriate historical preservation, Margaret concluded. It also provides sustainable funding through a shared value model that supports both ongoing operations and lighthouse restoration as the initiative's headquarters. The silence that followed her presentation lasted several seconds as the representatives studied the detailed proposal. Victor Ames from Coastal Treasures spoke first. "This is considerably more sophisticated than the typical finder's approach to historical artifacts," he acknowledged, professional respect evident in his tone. "Though I note the recovery value share percentages differ significantly from our original proposal. The percentages reflect relative contributions and jurisdictional realities," Catherine explained. "Private property caches follow different frameworks than those potentially on state lands or submerged in coastal waters." Elizabeth Chun studied the archaeological provisions with particular attention. "You've incorporated appropriate heritage protection protocols while providing practical recovery frameworks. This approach respects preservation requirements while facilitating responsible access." Dr. Hargrove added his perspective from the academic side. "The historical documentation protocols are excellent, particularly the comprehensive analysis requirements before any artifacts are removed from context. This ensures the archaeological significance isn't sacrificed to recovery operations." The discussion continued for hours, with each organization raising specific concerns and suggesting modifications to various provisions. Throughout, Margaret maintained her central role as the initiative's architect, demonstrating surprising facility with the complex intersection of historical preservation, archaeological ethics, and artifact recovery operations. By late afternoon, they had reached tentative agreement on a framework that balanced competing interests while providing appropriate recognition and compensation for all parties. Coastal Treasures would provide technical expertise and commercial valuation in exchange for rights to represent certain artifacts for private acquisition after full documentation. The State Office would ensure regulatory compliance while streamlining necessary permits. The Maritime Historical Society would coordinate research and preservation. This initiative represents a new model for approach in historical artifact recovery, Dr. Hargrove observed as they concluded. Rather than adversarial claims or exclusive exploitation, it creates a sustainable framework for balanced utilization of maritime heritage. Margaret felt a quiet sense of accomplishment as the meeting ended. The lighthouse keeper's widow had successfully brought together institutional powers that normally operated in separate spheres, finding common ground in Captain Blackthorne's meticulously preserved legacy. As the representatives gathered their materials, Victor Ames approached Margaret privately. Most people who discover valuable historical artifacts either try to sell them to the highest bidder or get overwhelmed by legal complexities. He said, "Candidly, your approach is refreshingly thoughtful. Coastal Treasures would be interested in discussing broader collaboration beyond the Blackthorne Initiative if this partnership proves successful." This unexpected professional respect from a seasoned commercial operator confirmed Margaret's growing confidence in her unexpected new role. What had begun as desperate survival had evolved into something that commanded attention from established experts in multiple fields. The following week brought the first tangible steps toward implementing the Blackthorne Maritime Heritage Initiative. Legal teams from each organization drafted formal agreements based on the framework Margaret had proposed. Preliminary research. Teams began correlating Blackthorne's cache data with modern geographical information and historical coastal records. Meanwhile, renovation work on the lighthouse keeper's quarters accelerated with historical preservation grants, approved and dedicated funding from the initiative allocated to restoration. Margaret could implement a comprehensive rehabilitation plan rather than merely essential repairs. Eleanor introduced her to craftspeople specializing in historical restoration, and the keeper's quarters gradually transformed from abandoned shelter to comfortable living space that honored its maritime heritage. The original wood floors were carefully restored rather than replaced. Period-appropriate fixtures were installed throughout. Modern systems for heating, plumbing, and electricity were integrated with minimal disruption to historical elements. "You've found the perfect balance between preservation and livability," Eleanor observed during a site visit. Too many historical renovations either sacrifice comfort for authenticity or modernize away all character. Margaret had moved from Eleanor's guest room into the partially completed keeper's quarters, establishing her permanent residence while renovation continued around her. The lighthouse tower remained a longer-term project, requiring specialized engineering and materials. That would take months to complete. The hidden chamber beneath the kitchen had been properly stabilized by structural engineers, maintaining its historical configuration while providing better protection for the materials still stored there. Most of the critical documents had been professionally conserved and digitized, with originals returned to temperature-controlled storage cabinets installed in the chamber, now accessible through a properly constructed entrance rather than the collapsed wall. 3 weeks after the initial joint meeting, the Blackthorne Maritime Heritage Initiative launched its first major recovery operation, detailed excavation of one of the merchant goods caches located on coastal land now part of a state park. The operation brought together archaeologists from the Society, compliance officers from the state, and recovery specialists from coastal treasures, all working under protocols established by the initiative. Margaret joined the expedition, observing. As specialists used ground-penetrating radar and Blackthorne's remarkably accurate directions to locate a buried chamber beneath what had once been a coastal trading post. The careful excavation revealed a substantial cache, exactly as described in Blackthorne's inventory: trade goods from captured merchant vessels, including silk textiles preserved in sealed containers, porcelain from China, and silver from Spanish territories. The artifacts, dating to the 1720s and in remarkable condition due to Blackthorne's careful preservation methods, represented a significant historical discovery beyond their considerable monetary value. The textiles in particular provided unprecedented examples of early 18th century trade goods rarely preserved in such condition. The successful recovery established the initiative's effectiveness, with each partner organization fulfilling its role in the balanced approach Margaret had designed. Academic documentation proceeded alongside proper conservation, while commercial valuation ensured appropriate compensation for all stakeholders, including the state park that hosted the discovery. When the expedition returned to port, media representatives waited at the dock. The Blackthorne Initiative partners had agreed on controlled publicity once significant discoveries were confirmed. Dr. Hargrove handled most communications, emphasizing the historical significance, while Margaret maintained a more limited public profile as the lighthouse owner who had discovered the records. The following week's headline in the Regional Heritage Journal captured the expedition's success. Pirate captain's secret maps lead to significant colonial-era discovery. National media quickly picked up the story, focusing on the romantic elements. Widow's lighthouse purchase reveals pirate treasure and lost history. Margaret found herself declining interview requests from national morning shows and documentary producers, preferring to maintain focus on the initiative's work rather than personal attention. Her years in education had taught her that sustainable results came from consistent effort rather than momentary recognition. The successful recovery operation accelerated the initiative's development with confirmed results and promising prospects for the remaining caches. The next target selected was one of the two primary treasure locations, a coastal cave that Blackthorne had described as containing the accumulated wealth of the Portuguese merchant fleet encounter, likely his most valuable single cache. Recovery planning revealed the technical complexity of this operation. The cave was partially submerged at high tide, requiring specialized equipment and expertise. The initiative assembled a team including marine archaeologists, conservation specialists, and technical recovery experts to ensure both success and proper preservation of context. Margaret's role evolved from discovery facilitator to active participant in strategic planning. Her background in art education proved unexpectedly valuable for coordinating between technical specialists, academic researchers, and institutional representatives, translating specialized knowledge across disciplines and ensuring effective collaboration. You have a remarkable ability to help experts communicate across their professional boundaries, Dr. Hargrove observed during a planning session. That's often the greatest challenge in multidisciplinary projects. The weeks leading up to the primary treasure recovery operation brought another significant development. The conservation team working on Blackthorne's journals discovered a section written in coded language that had initially been overlooked. After careful cryptographic analysis, they determined it contained information about Blackthorne's activities after supposedly disappearing in 1726. The decoded section revealed that, contrary to historical assumption, Blackthorne hadn't fled to the East Indies permanently. Instead, he had established a new identity as a legitimate merchant in Boston, eventually becoming a respected businessman while maintaining his hidden caches as insurance against discovery. He had lived until 1763, dying of natural causes as a wealthy colonial trader, his pirate past never discovered. This revelation transformed historical understanding of Blackthorne, from a pirate who had disappeared at the height of his notoriety, to a successful example of reinvention and integration, a man who had transformed criminal enterprise into legitimate business while preserving evidence of his former life for posterity. The discovery added another dimension to the historical significance of Margaret's lighthouse and its hidden chamber. Blackthorne hadn't merely used the lighthouse keeper's residence as a convenient hiding place. He had deliberately preserved his legacy through generations of keepers, ensuring his complete story would eventually emerge long after any legal consequences had faded into history. As the initiative prepared for the coastal cave excavation, Margaret spent an evening alone in the lighthouse tower's lantern room, watching the sunset paint the Atlantic horizon in brilliant colors. The massive glass panels had been restored, though the space remained unfurnished except for a single chair she had placed to enjoy the panoramic view. From this vantage point, she could see the full scope of what her desperate $300 purchase had become. The beautifully restored keeper's quarters below, now both comfortable home and initiative headquarters. The research vessel in the harbor, preparing for tomorrow's excavation. The visitors exploring the small museum exhibit she had established. In a converted outbuilding, sharing carefully selected artifacts and information about Blackthorne's legacy. Most importantly, she recognized how profoundly her own identity had transformed through this journey. The widow seeking basic shelter had become a respected leader in historical preservation and collaborative heritage management. The teacher, facing financial ruin, had become an educator on a broader stage, sharing the remarkable story of how desperation had led to discovery and renewal. What defined this transformation wasn't just the circumstances, the lucky discovery of valuable historical materials, but the approach she had brought to those circumstances. When faced with competing claims and complex challenges, she had sought balance rather than exclusion, collaboration rather than confrontation, innovation rather than convention. The coastal cave excavation the following day exceeded even optimistic projections. The recovery team successfully located the hidden chamber Blackthorne had described, preserved above the high tide line and sealed against moisture with remarkable effectiveness. The cache contained exactly what his inventory had recorded: chests of Spanish and Portuguese gold coins, jewelry taken from wealthy passengers, and trade goods of extraordinary value and historical significance. Most remarkable was a small leather-bound book nestled among the treasures, Blackthorne's personal memoir, written after he had established his new identity, reflecting on his transformation from pirate captain to respected merchant. The document provided unprecedented insight into the psychology and practical realities of colonial maritime piracy from a participant who had successfully abandoned that life. The financial value of this single recovery, even accounting for complex distribution among initiative partners, would provide Margaret with security beyond anything she had imagined possible after Robert's death. More importantly, the successful operation validated the Blackthorne Initiative's collaborative approach, demonstrating that balanced partnership could achieve results beyond what any single organization could accomplish independently. As media coverage of the recovery spread, the initiative received inquiries from other historical preservation organizations and government agencies interested in applying similar collaborative frameworks to archaeological projects worldwide. The model Margaret had developed was establishing new standards for how historical maritime resources could be approached, respecting both preservation values and recovery opportunities without sacrificing either to exclusive interests. 6 months after purchasing the abandoned lighthouse for $300, Margaret hosted a formal dedication ceremony for the fully restored Pemaquid Point Lighthouse and the officially established headquarters of the Blackthorne Maritime Heritage Initiative. Representatives from partner organizations, historical preservation societies, and local government attended the event, which celebrated both the physical restoration and the innovative historical recovery program it had spawned. During the ceremony, Dr. Hargrove unveiled a permanent exhibition in the Lighthouse Visitor Center, documenting Captain Blackthorne's extraordinary life and legacy from notorious pirate to successful merchant, his secret caches preserved for future generations to discover. The exhibition carefully balanced public, historical education with appropriate conservation of the most fragile original materials. Elizabeth Chen presented Margaret with a formal letter of recognition from the State Historical Preservation Office, acknowledging her exemplary stewardship of historically significant materials and commitment to proper archaeological methods through innovative collaborative approaches. Perhaps most meaningfully, genealogical research had identified several distant descendants of William Blackthorne through his later merchant identity. His great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter, herself a maritime archaeologist, presented Margaret with a replica of the navigational instruments found in the Lighthouse cache. "He would have approved of how you've handled his legacy," she told Margaret during the presentation. "His journals reveal a man who valued both adventure and careful planning, both bold action and patient strategy. Your initiative embodies that same balanced approach." As the formal ceremony concluded and guests explored the beautifully restored lighthouse, Margaret found a quiet moment alone in the lantern room at the tower's top. The space had been meticulously restored with both historical accuracy and modern safety considerations. The lighting mechanism returned to working order through a special arrangement with the Coast Guard Historical Division. From this vantage point, she could see the research vessel departing for investigation of the final cache location, visitors exploring the grounds of what had become both her home and a living historical site, and the Atlantic stretching to the horizon, the same waters where Captain Blackthorne had once sailed in search of fortune and freedom. The widow who had spent her last $300 on an abandoned lighthouse now stood as the founder and director of an internationally recognized historical initiative, the owner of a beautifully restored historical property, and the catalyst for a new model of collaborative maritime preservation. As the autumn sun began to set over the Atlantic, casting the distinctive shadow of the lighthouse across the waters where Blackthorne had once sailed, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed apparent disaster into unprecedented opportunity. The lighthouse that had been her desperate last resort had become a beacon in more ways than one, illuminating not just maritime navigation, but a path forward from loss to renewal, from ending to beginning, from desperation to possibility. What had started as a simple need for shelter had evolved into purpose, security, and contribution far beyond anything she could have imagined when facing eviction from her cottage. The story wasn't just about discovering hidden treasure, it was about recognizing that our greatest challenges often contain within them the seeds of our most remarkable opportunities, if we have the courage to pursue unconventional paths when traditional options disappear. As darkness fell and the restored lighthouse beam activated automatically, sweeping across the waters with the same purpose it had served for over 2 centuries, Margaret Wells, teacher, widow, lighthouse keeper, and now maritime history preservationist, embraced the unexpected journey that had brought her home. She thought about the countless people who faced their own moments of desperate decision, standing at crossroads where conventional options had failed them. Perhaps her story could serve as a reminder that sometimes the most unpromising paths, the abandoned lighthouse, the foreclosed property, the desperate gamble, might lead to possibilities beyond imagination if approached with courage, integrity, and openness to unexpected discovery. The beam from Pemaquid Point Lighthouse continued its steady rhythm through the darkness, not just guiding vessels to safe harbor, but illuminating a principle that transcended its stone tower and brilliant beam, that what appears as ending often conceals beginning. What seems like limitation often catalyzes innovation, and what begins as desperate survival can evolve into profound contribution that extends far beyond our individual circumstances to light pathways for others. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.